Candidate for Lily, and the reason why we are here in such numbers today is that continuing on with our recent announcements, we have some really exciting announcements that Bill's going to make today, so I might just hand over to Bill.
Thanks. This is Paul Newbury, our candidate running in Brisbane. It's great to be here at the Royal Brisbane, and I acknowledge the work of the staff, the volunteers that make it such a remarkable hospital. Chloe's here today. When she saw where I was going, she wanted to be here. Our Queensland families periodically had to call upon the remarkable services. So it's great to be able to come here and in part just say thank you. Thank you for looking after some of my family. I also should say and acknowledge the patients we've met. You know, politics is a privilege to serve, but to meet the people in the day oncology ward, people whose strength and resilience, strength in adversity, love of family, just really reminds us what it's all about. We overcomplicate politics in Australia. It's actually about family and it's about people. It's about health. That's what matters. But in particular, I'd like to acknowledge who'll be part of our conference today, the representatives who push for clinical trials in Australia. But it's a real privilege to me to be here with Kristen Larson, and we're going to hear a little bit more from Kristen. If we could bottle all of the ideas and goodwill and strength of character that Kristen has, this would be just a better country in every regard. I'm not trying to embarrass her too much. Anyway, to our announcement. As people know in Australia, on Thursday night I articulated Labor's vision, our plans, our Fair Go plan for Australia, but a centrepiece of what we think a fair go for Australians is to stand alongside them in their battle with cancer. I have a very simple view. Cancer makes you sick, but it shouldn't make you poor. Cancer may make you sick, but it shouldn't impoverish your family. I met an amazing woman upstairs. I met all the people I met upstairs on the floor were just standout. But I spoke to a lady called Elaine. Elaine got diagnosed in 2011. She's tried it all. What a strong character. You can just see her warmth of spirit. She's the sort of family member who you always want to see at Christmas time. And she was explaining to me, though, that the out-of-pocket cost of her battles, it's huge. She's such a great person. Various treatments have been tried. They've been well administered by the staff. But she just looked at me straight in the face and said, "They're not working, Bill. I'm going to try something else, but it's only got a small percentage chance of success." She needs the clinical trials, and Kristen will talk more about that in a moment. She also said to me, and I said, "Listen, how's it been with the out-of-pocket costs?" She said, and that's when she spoke about her fight with cancer directly. When she had to speak about the costs, that's when she teared up. She's such a fantastic soul that she said, "I don't want to leave my family with the debt." She's worried about them. How did we get to be in Australia where the patient has to worry about everything else? That's not on. That's just not on. Next time you hear someone from the government say, "Oh, most of the system's covered," no, it's not. I think of Elaine. She is tens of thousands of dollars in debt. She's trying to work out with her superannuation, but the purpose of superannuation was never to try and cover your cancer bills, was it? It was to be there when you retire. How do we have a system in Australia that people fall through the net and they've got to find that service their own debts? You know, when you get cancer and it's serious and you go through the various stages, in many cases you can't keep working, the income stops. If anything else happens in the family which is a financial disadvantage, well then you're very much on the brink, aren't you? That is why we need to do more. I've said on Thursday night, and Catherine King and I have been travelling the country since, we will make sure that millions of more scans get paid for. No gap payment, no gap. You don't have to pay for it. Same with seeing the specialists. No gap. We just want to take the financial burden off people. We want to put more into capital. Also make it available treatment not in the big cities, because the travel here is very difficult if you're not fortunate enough to live in proximity. We've also said we want to support services. You know, the family services, the services to help kids diagnosed with cancer. And today what we want to do is back in our clinical trials. We've got the best researchers in the world, and they're working with the best of the rest of the world. And sometimes when the existing drugs don't work, all you've got in the fight is hope. We want to provide more hope. Hope is not an ingredient you can pay $1 for, but you can provide hope, fundamental to the psychological well-being and the resilience of a cancer patient, through investing in clinical trials. We are going to put more money into clinical trials. Not because we think that every trial is guaranteed a success, but because we owe it to Australians diagnosed with cancer to not give up. We ask Australians with cancer not to give up. I met a ward full of people who don't know how to give up. Never bought a white flag in their life. They don't know how to give up. But when we leave them with massive out-of-pocket costs, we're giving up on them. When we don't fund clinical trials, we're giving up on them. We are not the people they are. So now I'd like to hand over to Catherine King to talk forever how we won't give up. We won't give up because this country can afford to pay for clinical trials. This country can afford to get rid of the out-of-pocket expenses in many cases for cancer patients. We can't solve it all. This nation is rich enough. We can prioritise. We don't have to give tax breaks to the top end. We don't have to give so many subsidies to property investors. But we need to do more to help the waiting rooms all around Australia. We need to be as strong as Christian is, as Elaine is, and as hundreds of thousands of our fellow Australians. That's our promise. I'd like to hand over to Catherine, then we can hear more. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. And look, it's terrific to be here with so many colleagues as well. Can I also acknowledge John Zaltzberg, who's one of Australia's leading oncologists, who's head of the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, and it's really the work of John and many others who we are celebrating here today. I also really want to recognise Christian. I met Christian well over a year ago now as part of the Ovarian Cancer Australia Ambassadors, and she has been very influential in Labor, having previously made an announcement about $12 million to actually try and deal with this scourge of ovarian cancer, a disease that takes too many women from us. But today, of course, we're announcing $26 million to go to the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, because in public hospitals all the way around this country, there are fantastic clinicians doing great work with clinical trials, and we want to link these trials up. The power of people being able to be linked together with oncologists, with public hospitals, right the way across the country is really the vision that the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance has. This $26 million will allow them to look at two particular research projects, one of them in depth in cancer, as to how you make sure that patients in public hospitals across the country are linked together with clinical trials, and those clinical trials are linked nationally as well as internationally. But what they also want to do is make sure we've got more clinical trial coordinators across the country, making sure that that terrific work our researchers are doing is not duplicated, is actually reaching out into every public hospital. And they want to embed into the practice of clinicians through every public hospital in the country that clinical trials and that knowledge that you learn from those clinical trials is actually part of everyday practice of medicine in our public hospitals. So we're very delighted about this announcement today. I know from talking to Christian many times just how important being able to have access to cutting-edge medicine, but particularly clinical trials, has been to her. She's been a fantastic advocate for ovarian cancer, and I know this will be a very important announcement for her today, and I'm going to hand over to her to say a few words.
Thank you, Catherine and Bill. My name's Kristen Larson, and I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer when I was 21 years old. I was basically told that I only had a couple of months to live. The statistics for ovarian cancer are absolutely horrible, and the drugs that exist currently, they're not very effective. So the only hope I really had was to try clinical trials and to get the latest research to my bedside. Through having clinical trials, I've celebrated 5 years of life since diagnosis, which is a day we never thought would come. And I am so excited to hear this announcement because it will make such a huge difference, not only for me, but for other cancer patients. Where we stand, the Royal Brisbane Hospital used to be my second home, but I actually had to leave this hospital because it's a public hospital and I ran out of clinical trials that were available here. And I had to move to a private clinic, costing me so much money out of pocket and leaving me in a lot of debt. But it was the only option I had, as clinical trials are the only drugs that can give me any hope of extending my life and killing the cancer inside of me. So I'm so excited and grateful for this announcement, because access to drugs shouldn't be, determined by the money in your wallet or your postcode even. It should be available to anyone with cancer who needs the drug, not just those who can afford private health insurance and have access to a private clinic. So thank you so much, Bill, for this announcement, because I really appreciate it and it will save lives, including mine. Thank you.
Yeah, we can get the details, but why don't I get our health spokesperson to really unpack it for you?
That's of the 26 million you're after? Yes. So 12 million will be going towards the 2 research projects, and 10 million will go towards the clinical research coordinators, and 4 million, and this is over a period of 4 years, 4 million will be going to embedding that clinical research in. We've also got Professor John Zeltsberg here, who will be available to the media afterwards if you'd like to talk to him about more detail about how that's going to work. Yes, that's correct, over the forward estimates of the budget. Thank you. So it's part of our overall $2.3 billion package. It's not out of the Medical Research Future Fund.
Mr. Shorten, Labor's primary vote in the news poll has dropped to the lowest effect since July. Is this a signal that the party's doing something wrong?
Listen, I think the election is a very clear choice. And as we've heard today, I'm really positive about fighting this election about priorities. The question was asked earlier, where's the money coming from? Government's about choices. I met a ward full, and in fact there's a staff here, the staff, all of the patients, all the families. I think this hospital unites us about what is important in the nation and politics, and why I am so positive about Labor's policy, our Fair Go plan for Australia. The most important things in politics, not the day-to-day noise, not some of the, attack dog stuff and all of the, what annoys people about politics. What Australian politics should be about is about your family and your health. And it is a very good wake-up call for me today to be reminded, when I watch families who haven't given up, people who haven't given up, politics shouldn't give up on the people. So yes, I make no apology for wanting better cancer treatment, not bigger multinationals. I make no apology for wanting better hospitals, not bigger tax loopholes for the top end of town. It's about priorities. Last Thursday night, Labor outlined a vision to help Australians with their out-of-pocket costs on cancer. We do this because it's the right thing to do. We do this because at the moment there is a massive problem in Australia that the out-of-pocket costs of fighting cancer are too big. We are not doing enough. This country is not doing enough to help patients in the fight of their life. 1 in 2 Australians by the age of 85 will be diagnosed with a cancer. Look, the 100 people here, that's 50 people will be diagnosed with cancer by the age of 85. Cancer makes you sick, but it shouldn't make you poor. That is why Labor is articulating a $2.3 billion additional package, the largest single injection of a new frontier in Medicare, which is helping people with their out-of-pockets. Now, we're doing the other priorities too, helping our GPs, putting more money into mental health, repairing the damage done by the current government into cuts to hospitals. But we think that this country shouldn't just have a basic Medicare, as good as it is. I want Australia to be the best in the world at helping our citizens fight cancer, not the best in the world at having the most exotic tax loopholes.
Should Melissa Price make a decision on the Adani sub-approval before the caretaker period starts?
Well, I think it's extraordinary to read in today's newspapers that LNP politicians are bullying the Minister for the Environment, saying you'll lose your job in the government if you don't give us the answer we want on Adani. This is a failure of ethics at government at the highest level. It just highlights the chaos and the division within the government. This is a government which is broken. They can't agree on anything. I mean, they've had 3 prime ministers, they've had 13 energy policies, 22 reshuffles, but to highlight how broken this government is, I'd like to invite Tanya Plibersek to talk about the colossal scandalous numbers which this government, rather than call an election, is pouring down the drain, taxpayer money, just to resuscitate their flagging reputation. But Tanya?
Well, thanks very much, Bill. And you are so right when you said government is about choices. People have a choice to support your united and disciplined team with the positive vision that you've laid out, or buy the dodgy ad campaign from the dodgy ad guy. And this morning, we thought that the Liberals were spending about $600,000 a day on this ad campaign. So if you're a taxpayer, you're watching those ads on TV, you're seeing them in your bus shelter, you've got a government that is using your tax dollars to advertise to you about the dodgy cuts they've made in health and education. But as we've watched Senate estimates this morning, we found out that in fact it's even worse than we thought. We've got a finance minister who refuses to say how much this government's spending on advertising. But by looking at the AusTender website, we've worked out that this government's actually spent $136 million of taxpayers' money advertising their cuts to health, their cuts to schools, to taxpayers, trying to fool them, trying to pull the wool over their eyes. So this government's now spending about $1 million a day of your money telling you what a great job they're doing. Instead of using $1 million a day of taxpayers' money talking about schools, perhaps they should use that money to restore the $14 billion they've cut from government schools around Australia. Instead of using $1 million a day of taxpayers' money to talk about what a great job they're doing in healthcare, perhaps they should follow Labor's lead and properly fund cancer care. It is only a dodgy ad guy like Scott Morrison who would think it's okay to use $1 million a day of taxpayers' money to try and spruik what a great job his government's doing against all evidence. It's the same guy that was prepared to spend more than $180 million to fly to Christmas Island for a press conference, again on taxpayers' funds. Instead of thinking that Scott Morrison can fix 6 years of chaos and division with 6 weeks' worth of publicly funded advertising, perhaps he should come up with a positive vision for the future as we have.
Mr. Shorten, if you win the election, would you seek to have financial approvals?
Well, first of all, let's be clear on Adani, because this government really struggles with it, doesn't it? We'll be guided by the best science and by the law of the land, and we won't be ripping up any contracts. But this government says one thing in Victoria and another thing in North Queensland. But even I couldn't have predicted that the Minister for Environment will get bullying and intimidating letters from her colleagues saying, unless you make the decision this way, you will lose your job. Like, why on earth don't we have a National Anti-Corruption Commission? Because that is not the appropriate use of political influence to threaten your job as Environment Minister unless you do as I say. The problem for the current Prime Minister is he has a mutiny. In fact, he has 2 mutinies. He's got a mutiny on his southern flank in the big cities who say they're concerned about, being accused of doing nothing on climate change. Too late for that problem. They have done nothing on climate change. But he's got a mutiny on his northern flank because he's made promises there which he can't sustain. This is a divided government, and if we really think this government was fair income on real action on climate change, Malcolm Turnbull would still be the Prime Minister. Well, let's see what's happened between now and then. I mean, really, to be able to predict what this government's going to do, what we will do if we form a government is we will adhere to the law. We will adhere to the law. There won't be hate letters from one member of the government to another member of the government saying you must do X or you must do Y. We will practice transparent government, full stop. But we have also said, and I want to make it very clear, I'm not going to use taxpayer money to prop up the Adani project, and I think most Australians agree with that. More broadly on energy, let's not fall for the trick that somehow us adhering to the law on Adani and being guided by science means that we don't want to have fossil fuels as part of our energy mix. We do. But for the export industry in Queensland, I don't think the budget numbers would have been anywhere near as good as they were. And so therefore we recognise that fossil fuels, gas and coal, will be part of our energy mix, as will renewables. Because you can't, with respect to you and the government, they can't tell me what's happening now. So what you're saying is predict what this government will do in the next 6 weeks. I think it's hard to predict what this government will do in the next 6 hours. Are you sure they will give the federal approvals? We don't know. So I can't really deal with a hypothetical, but we've got an act and we'll adhere to the law. I don't know why the government's tied itself in such knots. We've also got to see what the Queensland government does. When we know all the facts, then we can make the decisions. What we want is policy based on the law, not based on politics.
You've said that you'll rely on the best science and that follow the law. The Commonwealth, as it stands, follows the law and has access to some of the best science. Do you think they've been using it?
Oh, I don't think anyone knows what this government's doing. Listen, this government is in meltdown. Just scenes, and we heard last week, I mean, I don't know what's going on in the government. To some extent, the sideshow, which is now the national government of Australia, shouldn't distract us from the future. But you know, we hear that delegations of angry members of parliament have gone and demanded the minister do one thing. We hear other delegations of angry members of parliament have demanded they do another thing. Like, this country's at a crossroads on climate change. It's a crossroads it's at a crossroads on instability. We all know that what Australians really want out of the government in Canberra is not too much. They just want to be sure that they'll have one Prime Minister for 3 years and that there's a united team behind that Prime Minister.
Just on electric cars,
yeah.
$100 million for the charging stations. In terms of what taxpayers should be investing in, should they look at the rapid recharging stations or the stations now that are for the cars that are on the road?
Well, let's go to the heart of this issue on electric vehicles, and I'm very fortunate that Senator Keneally, who's with us, has been doing a fair bit of homework on the government's policies and ours. But for electric vehicles, we do see that as part of the future in terms of our response on climate change. We see it as part of the future in terms of jobs. We see electric vehicles as, throughout the world, the development and uptake's increasing. All the experts have said around the world there'll be 2 billion electric vehicles by 2050. In Australia, we believe that it's a good idea to set a goal, a target, that 50% of new car sales by 2030 will be electric vehicles. That doesn't mean we're going to confiscate someone's ute in 2030. It doesn't mean that. And indeed, our policy was based, of course, on the best research, but I'd now like to hand over to Christina, who's been doing a fair bit of work on the government's ever-changing position on this, like everything else.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks, it's great to be here in Queensland. And your question is about ultra-fast charging stations. They do charge cars in about 8 minutes. How do we know that? We know that because Angus Taylor told us so himself in October of 2018 when he announced that his government, the Morrison government, would be actually funding the development of those ultra-charging stations. I also think what's going to happen with electric vehicles? Well, the transport sector is equivalent to what the iPhone did to the communications sector. Those people today who ridicule electric vehicles will probably be the ones buying them in a decade's time. Now, those aren't my words, although I do agree with them. Those are Josh Frydenberg's words. Here he is, Joshy, hanging out with some electric vehicles. There we go, right there in the parliament. Oh, Stuart Robert. Now, some people say that, that will the grid be able to manage electric vehicles? It will, unless maybe if Stuart Robert is downloading on his home internet. Greg Hunt. Greg Hunt, here he is hanging out. He's got a whole bus. It's proclaiming 0 emissions. Good on you, Greg, standing behind the electric vehicle network. Josh is back. Here he is. And that's at Parliament, for those of you who may not recognize it. And here's Josh driving around Parliament in his electric vehicle. He's so keen to trump the arrival of electric vehicles in Australia. Jason Falinski. Now, an issue is going mainstream if Jason Falinski's getting behind it, because this guy hasn't been on the cutting edge of anything since he emerged from the womb. Here's Jason. I mean, he's working on a car. I personally would not let Jason work on my car, but here he is, inspecting an electric vehicle. Oh, Paul Fletcher. Sparkling personality to go along with his love of electric vehicles. Oh, Linda Reynolds. Here she is from WA. People in Queensland might not recognise the now Minister Linda Reynolds. There she is driving around in Western Australia. And finally, Josh again. He's hanging out here with Paul Fletcher, and that's Andy Vasey from, well, less said about him the better. He and Josh don't apparently get along very often. Anyway, this government has a climate solutions package. You know what's in that climate solutions package? The Morrison government's climate solutions package? A target that by 2030, 50% of new vehicle sales in Australia will be electric vehicles. We know that from Senate estimates last week. We also know it because Josh Frydenberg, helpfully this week, sent out a letter to his whole electorate, trumpeting the electric vehicle policy of his government. So, folks, when you hear Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor rubbishing the notion that electric vehicles can be and will be a future transport solution for Australia, remember this: it is their policy they're rubbishing, it is their plans, it is their commitment that they're rubbishing. And yes, I look forward to the day when I see Josh Frydenberg again driving around Parliament House in his electric car.
Mr. Shorten, do you have an electric vehicle, or will you commit to your next car being an electric vehicle?
I have an internal combustion engine. I don't have an electric vehicle. In terms of my next car, I haven't given that a lot of thought, to be honest. I'll tell you what I've given thought to. This country's got to move beyond debates about being scared of new technology. Really, if you really want to see to where the current government's sunk, they're rubbishing electric vehicles because they want to run a scare campaign that somehow people are going to lose their SUVs and utes now. That is a complete lie. We have gone, full peak absurdity in this government. That this government now reminds you of the people who said that FM radio would never replace AM. These are the people who would probably say that vinyl will never be replaced by CD, and don't even talk about Spotify. That's just magic. This government is a government who probably would have argued that we've got to keep leaded petrol, and who cares about the pollution because unleaded will never happen and it's too expensive. We have now got a government in Canberra who will give you a second-class NBN with their bad copper technology. This is a government who's now arguing against sensible and modest measures to have an electric car industry when, 3 months ago, or this week in the case of the current Treasurer, they're backing it in. This is a scare campaign because they can't take real action on climate change. They want you to be frightened of the future as much as they're frightened of their future.
What's your reaction to the IMF saying it's concerned about Australia's real estate market and the need to spend more on infrastructure or cut interest rates to make up for that?
Well, that goes to the heart of the budget message on Tuesday. What a dreary, dull, colourless, wimpy document this budget was. Except, of course, it magicked up a very flimsy surplus forecast. And I think the IMF makes points about the need to invest in infrastructure and to be wary of global interest rates. The reality is that in the last 10 years, the world has increased global debt from 130 trillion US to 230 trillion US. Global debt is a big problem. And what we've got is a government with no plan to give Australia a fighting fund to deal with changes in the world economy. This is a government who is a reform-free space. They're devoid of reform. The R word in reform did not speak its name in the budget. And the other thing they've done in this budget is they've built this flimsy surplus forecast on the back of robbing the disability insurance scheme. I mean, this government should be ashamed of itself, and this needs to be explained to the Australian people. They've basically mismanaged the National Disability Insurance Scheme for the best part of 5.5 years since they came in. They sacked the board. They put a cap on the number of staff who could help families and people living with disability do the job. So having manufactured a pipeline of service in the NDIS with a very small output, they managed not to spend all the money they had allocated. And they say, oh, see, no problems there. The problem is people living with disability and their families know that this government hasn't done the work to make sure they get the packages of support. And the government's used that money that they have pretended not to need to spend to pump up the tyres in a very saggy surplus forecast. So I think the IMF is right. We need to have more infrastructure spending. That's why we're doing so much infrastructure in southeast Queensland if we get elected, and indeed throughout Queensland. It's why, in fact, that we're making sure that we get wages moving again in this country. The fact of the matter is, if we want to have a healthy economy, you've got to make real reforms. That's why we're going after multinationals to make them pay their fair share of tax, get a proper healthy surplus, which is a fighting fund for whatever challenges the world produces, and we can do it because of our reforms and still properly fund our schools, our hospitals, and of course take action on climate change, make sure that in Australia we change the scenario where everything's going up except your wages, get wages going. And to return to where we started this press conference, only Labor has a plan to help Australians in the fight of their lives, to make sure that we can tackle the horrendous out-of-pocket costs of cancer treatment in Australia. We've got a very good health system. Cancer makes you sick, but it shouldn't make you poor.
Mr. Shorten, Senator Keneally's obviously playing a fairly prominent role in your campaign. What role would you like her to play in the government?
One step at a time, Stephen. Let's win the election. Let's win the election because we've got a fair go plan. I say to voters who may watch some of this or be seeing it being streamed live, I understand that what people hate about Australian politics is when the politicians are consumed with themselves. Christina's one of my many talented people in my United team. We're not focused on a particular position. What we are focused on is making sure that when you're in the fight of your lives, you're not on your own. That we don't give up on you, just as you haven't given up on yourselves. We're focused on making sure there's more apprenticeships, 150,000. We're focused on getting wages moving. We're focused on not being afraid of new technology, but embracing it and making it work in the interest of all Australians. Thank you. Oh, listen, people have got a right to protest, but I, for one, don't support protesting about farmers. Farmers are the backbone of Australia. Everything we eat has been grown by a farmer. We should be having protests thanking our farmers rather than bagging them. Of course, that doesn't mean that you sustain the live sheep export industry, which I think has had too many strikes. It's failed too often. You can be pro-farmer without supporting a business model which is cruel to animals. But, you know, I tend to say to those people who are very extreme, you know, I don't like extremists of whatever persuasion, leave our farmers alone. They've gone through drought, they go through all sorts of difficult circumstances. That's why Labor's going to stand up for the farmers against the big banks. That's why, for instance, we are going to see the files of the last 5 years where people have been unfairly kicked off the land be reopened. Because we actually understand that if you want to be pro-farmer, you've got to straighten out the banks. We're helping restock the North Queensland herd, and we're also very committed to making sure that dairy farmers get a fair deal. So we've got good plans for farmers. We're not interested in protesting against them. Thanks, everybody.